No, your hand immediately shoots down to hold your toe and massage your throbbing toe because it's suffering, right? Because here's the thing. When one part of the body is suffering, it's just not possible for the rest of the body to simply ignore it. There is a sense in which the whole body suffers and hurts with the injured part. The same is true, of course, for the body of Christ. When one of us is hurting, when one of us is suffering, perhaps an injustice, being mistreated, when one of us is in need, the rest of us cannot simply dismiss him or her with a flippant, "Too bad, glad it's not me." We can't really do that because when one part of the body hurts, the rest of us can't possibly ignore that. There's a really true sense in which we all hurt with the suffering of the injured party. You see, when we surround a hurting member of the family with genuine concern and sincere prayer and practical help, we reflect the light of the sun into a very dark world. Well, then the author turns a corner in verse 4 to talk about marriage and sexuality. Listen to what he says. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure. For God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. The author is saying that marriage should never be treated lightly. And it often is, isn't it? It was true in their culture, it is in ours. Marriage should not be treated lightly. It should be highly esteemed as something precious and of great value. Marriage to God is something of great worth. And then the author goes on to warn about two different kinds of sexual sin. He uses the word adultery and the word sexual immorality. Now, adultery is a more specific word referring, of course, to being unfaithful to one's marriage vows. Sexual immorality is a more general word, broader in reference, making reference to any kind of sexual sin, sexual act outside of marriage. So between these two phrases, it kind of covers the gamut. And it leaves only one appropriate and holy place for sexual activity to take place. And that, of course, is between a husband and a wife. Period. And then he goes on to issue a warning. And he's saying essentially this: any kind of sexual behavior, any kind of sexual behavior with anyone besides your spouse is a sexual sin. And if you ignore this warning, the judgment of God is going to come upon you. It will. The judgment of God will come upon you because God holds the marriage bed to be sacred, even if we don't. Of course, the opposite is also true. That if we nurture a loving and selfless and generous sexual relationship with our spouse, that calls forth the blessing of God. Not only on us, but really on the world as well. Because here's the thing. When we are celibate before marriage, and when we are faithful in marriage, we reflect the light of the sun into a desperately dark world. And then verse 5, he turns another corner, and he turns to money and possessions. He says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. Now, as I was studying this chapter, this particular verse really grabbed my attention. And I was actually rather surprised to see what the author offers as the motive that lurks beneath greed. Greed, the love of money. He says there's a motive underlying that, and it might surprise you as well. It's fear. Oftentimes, it's fear or unbelief that drives us to greed. We become greedy for more because we really don't trust that God is going to provide for our needs. And this is akin to accusing God of incompetence or negligence, as our provider. That kind of attitude is inconsistent with a commitment to Jesus Christ. And that's why Jesus said, you can't serve both God and money. You're going to end up loving one and hating the other. And so he says, keep your lives free from the love of money. Interesting word, keep. That implies that it will be our constant tendency to shift into this idolatry. So even if it's not true of you today, even if you would say, I don't really love money, that's not an idol I struggle with, we have to be very vigilant and very careful to keep ourselves from the love of money. The default position is to love it. I'll share with you a quick story, a true story from the life of Corrie ten Boom. Many of you know who she was. Her family harbored Jews, hid them from the Gestapo. She herself survived a Nazi concentration camp. But she tells a story from her youth when she was quite young. There was one morning, when her family prayed, her father in particular, asked that God would bring somebody, a customer, into the family store to purchase a watch because they had expenses, they had bills incurred at the bank, and they needed the money. So God, please send a customer to buy a watch today. Well, that very day, a man with a significant amount of money came into the store and purchased a very expensive watch. But as he was paying for the watch, he was explaining to her father, Casper, that this was actually a replacement watch. He had to buy a second one because he just recently purchased a watch from a Christian watchmaker, and it turned out to be a dud. It doesn't work at all. Complaining that that Christian man had cheated him, swindled him. He was angry. So Casper said, hey, could I see the timepiece that you recently purchased? And the man turned it over to him, and he examined it very carefully and noticed that it was just a minor modification that needed to be made, just a very small repair. So he quickly made that repair free of charge, handed the watch back to him, assuring him that indeed this was a fine piece, a very high quality piece of craftsmanship that would work for him for many years. He'd be very pleased with it. And then he handed back all of his money, refunded all of the money he had just paid for the replacement watch. And the man was dumbfounded as he walked out of the store with his original watch, fully functional, free of charge. Well, Corrie was also dumbfounded. So she asked her dad, she said, Papa, why did you do that? Aren't you worried about the bills at the bank? And Casper replied, Corrie, you need to understand something. You see, there is blessed money and there is unblessed money. And the Father would not have been pleased if I had allowed a Christian brother's reputation to be ruined, even if it was to our profit. Don't worry, Corrie. God will provide. Corrie tells that within the next few days, a few days later, another customer came into the store and purchased the single most expensive watch that was made at that time. The proceeds of which not only paid for all of the family bills, but also provided so that Corrie could go for 2 years to become a watchmaker in Switzerland. I share that because he's a shining example of what it looks like to keep our lives free from the love of money. How about you today? Where is your heart in regards to money? Does greed grip your heart today? Are you struggling with that idolatry? Are you thinking about money all the time and wishing you had more and wanting more things and accumulating material things? Does that preoccupy your mind? Well, could I offer an antidote to you? It's radical, but it works. Give it away.